My name is Joaquin Restrepo, and I'm a commercial fisherman from San Diego. When Yellowstone erupted and ash started falling like snow, I made a split-second decision that saved my crew's lives. While other boats rushed back to harbor, I turned south toward Mexico. Those boats never made it home. They're frozen solid in San Diego's harbor right now. The next 48 hours tested everything I thought I knew about survival, leadership, and what it means to make impossible choices when the world ends around you. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from. In the comment section below, perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Restrepo, but everyone calls me Joker. I earned that nickname over 15 years working the waters off San Diego, always cracking jokes during the worst storms to keep my crew's spirits up. At 34, I've seen enough rough weather to know when something's not right with the ocean. I captain a 42-foot fishing vessel called La Gaviota, which means seagull in Spanish. She's not much to look at, but she's kept me and my crew alive through hurricanes, engine failures, and more near misses than I care to count. October 15th, 2024 started like any other Tuesday morning. My alarm went off at 3:30, same as always. I grabbed my thermos of coffee and headed down to the harbor while San Diego was still sleeping. The plan was simple: take La Gaviota out about 12 miles southwest of Point Loma, drop our lines for tuna and swordfish, and hopefully come back with enough catch to make the fuel costs worthwhile. Gas prices had been killing us small operators all year, and I needed a good day to stay afloat financially. My crew consisted of 2 men I'd trust with my life. Miguel Sandoval, 42 years old, had been fishing these waters longer than I'd been alive. His weathered hands could tie knots in the dark, and he could smell a storm coming from 50 miles away. The man had a wife and 2 kids back in National City, and he worked harder than anyone I knew to provide for them. Then there was Santos Morales, 61, who'd been my uncle's partner before I took over the boat. Santos had been talking about retirement for the past 3 years, always joking that he was going to buy a little house in Tijuana and spend his golden years drinking beer on the beach. He had a daughter named Maria who worked as a teacher in San Diego, and you could see his whole face light up whenever he talked about her. We met at the dock around 4 in the morning, same routine we'd followed for years. Miguel was already loading the ice while Santos checked the engine. I went through my usual pre-departure checklist: fuel levels, our ADIO equipment, emergency supplies, life jackets, flares, and the small medical kit I kept stocked with bandages, antiseptic, and basic medications. My uncle had drilled into me the importance of being prepared for anything when you're hours away from shore. He used to say that the ocean doesn't care about your plans, and the only thing standing between you and disaster is what you bring with you. The weather report called for clear skies and light winds, perfect conditions for a productive day. The ocean looked calm as glass when we pulled away from the dock, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a nagging feeling in my gut that made me double-check our emergency equipment. I'd learned to trust those instincts over the years. The sea has a way of teaching you to pay attention to the small details that other people miss. About an hour into our trip, Miguel pointed out something strange. The dolphins were swimming differently than usual, moving in tight, agitated circles instead of their normal, playful arcs. They seemed to be heading toward deeper water, all of them at once, like they were fleeing from something. I'd never seen behavior like that in all my years fishing these waters. Santos laughed it off, saying maybe they'd found a school of fish we didn't know about, but Miguel and I exchanged glances. We both knew dolphins don't act like that unless something's wrong. The birds were acting strange too. Instead of flying out to sea like they normally did in the morning, the pelicans and gulls were all heading inland, toward the mountains. They flew in formation, purposeful and urgent, like they had somewhere important to be. I mentioned it to the crew, But Santos just shrugged and said animals do weird things sometimes. Still, I made a mental note to keep an eye on our surroundings. My uncle always said that when the animals start acting different, smart fishermen. Pay attention. By 5:30, we'd reached our usual fishing spot, 12 miles southwest of Point Loma. The water was unusually cold for October, cold enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled. In all my years fishing these waters, I'd never experienced morning temperatures like that. During the fall, Miguel commented on it too, saying it reminded him of winter mornings in December, not mid-October. We checked the water temperature with our fish finder, and it was running about 10 degrees below normal for this time of year. The fish finder was showing something else unusual. All the marine life was diving deep, deeper than I'd ever seen them go during daylight hours. Normally, fish come toward the surface in the morning to feed, but our sonar was picking up massive schools of tuna and other species at depths of 300 feet or more. It was like they were trying to get as far from the surface as possible. Miguel suggested we adjust our lines to reach the deeper water, but I was starting to get a bad feeling about the whole situation. Around 6 o'clock, while we were setting up our gear, the radio started crackling with interference. At first, I thought it was just atmospheric conditions causing static, but the interference had a pattern to it, like it was coming from multiple sources at once. I tried switching channels, but every frequency was filled with the same crackling noise. Santos joked that maybe the military was running exercises, but I'd never heard interference like that before. The sound made my skin crawl like fingernails on a chalkboard. That's when we heard the alert that changed everything. At exactly 6:03 in the morning, the Coast Guard's emergency frequency crackled to life with a voice I'll never forget. The radio operator sounded like he was reading from a script, but his voice was shaking. All vessels. This is United States Coast Guard San Diego. We have received reports of a major geological event at Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone has blown. Repeat, Yellowstone has blown. All vessels are advised to monitor emergency frequencies for further instructions. The three of us stood there staring at the radio like it was some kind of joke. Santos started laughing, saying it had to be some kind of drill, or maybe a Halloween prank someone was playing early. Miguel looked confused, asking what it meant. For a place in Wyoming to blow. I knew what they were talking about though. I'd seen documentaries about the Yellowstone supervolcano, how scientists had been monitoring it for years, waiting for signs of an eruption. They always said it was a matter of when, not if. But volcanoes didn't just explode in America, right? That was something that happened in faraway places like Iceland or Italy. Not in Wyoming, not in the United States. I tried to convince myself that the Coast Guard was overreacting, that maybe it was just a small eruption that would be contained quickly. After all, we were over 1,000 miles away from Yellowstone. What could possibly happen to us all the way out here on the Pacific Ocean? I tried calling the Coast Guard back for clarification, but all I got was that same crackling interference. Other fishing boats in the area were trying to reach them too, their voices mixing together in a confused chorus of questions and concern. Captain Rodriguez from the Maria Elena was asking for details about the evacuation procedures. The crew of the San Miguel wanted to know if they should return to port immediately. Nobody seemed to have any answers. That's when I noticed the sky starting to change. It was subtle at first, just a slight dimming of the morning light, like a cloud passing over the sun. But there weren't any clouds in the sky, just clear blue stretching to the horizon. The dimming continued, slowly but steadily, until the bright morning sun started to look pale and weak. Miguel pointed it out first, saying it looked like the sun was wearing sunglasses. We all laughed at that, but nervously. By 7 o'clock, the sky was definitely darker than it should have been. The blue was turning to gray, not the gray of storm clouds, but something else entirely. Something wrong. The temperature was dropping too, noticeably and quickly. In the span of an hour, it had gone from chilly to genuinely cold. I found myself putting on the heavy jacket I normally only wore during winter fishing trips. Then the ash started falling. At first, it looked exactly like snow, these delicate gray flakes drifting down from a sky that had turned the color of charcoal. Santos caught some of it in his palm, saying it felt like powder, soft and fine. Miguel tasted a bit of it and immediately spat it out, saying it was bitter and chalky. I recognized what it was immediately: volcanic ash. From Yellowstone. Over 1,000 miles away. The three of us stood on the deck of La Gaviota, watching ash fall like snow on the Pacific Ocean in October. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, like witnessing something that shouldn't exist. The flakes were so light they seemed to dance in the air before settling on everything around us. Within minutes, the boat was covered in a fine gray powder, and we could see our footprints in it as we moved around the deck. The radio came alive again with reports from other boats. Captain Martinez from the fishing vessel Esperanza reported ash falling 20 miles north of our position. The crew of the Pacific Dream said they could see a dark cloud moving in from the northeast, covering the entire sky. A pleasure craft called the Weekend Warrior was calling for help, saying their engine was starting to cough and sputter. The Coast Guard was trying to coordinate responses, but their transmissions were getting weaker and filled with more static. By 8 o'clock, the ash was falling heavily enough that visibility was dropping. I could barely see the shoreline in the distance, and other boats that had been visible on the horizon were disappearing into the gray haze. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and ice was starting to form on the railings of our boat. Ice. In October. In San Diego waters. I'd been fishing these waters for 15 years, and I'd never seen anything like it. Santos was getting worried about his daughter Maria. He kept trying to call her on his cell phone, but the signal was weak and kept cutting out. When he finally got through, she told him that ash was falling in San Diego too, that the whole city was covered in a gray blanket. The schools were closing, and people were being told to stay indoors. She sounded scared, and that made Santos scared too. He started talking about heading back to port immediately. Miguel agreed with Santos. He wanted to get back to his family, to make sure his wife and kids were safe. The logical thing to do was to head back to San Diego Harbor, only 12 miles to the northeast. It would be an easy trip, even with the reduced visibility. We had enough fuel, and we knew these waters like the back of our hands. Every instinct should have told me to turn around and go home. But something deep in my gut was telling me that going home would be a mistake. I can't explain it rationally, but I'd learned to trust those feelings over the years. The ocean has a way of teaching you to listen to your instincts, and right now, every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay away from the coast. Maybe it was the way the ash was falling, or the unusual behavior of the marine life, or just the sheer wrongness of everything that was happening. Whatever it was, I knew that heading back to San Diego Harbor would be the worst decision I could make. I told Santos and Miguel that we needed to head south instead, toward the Mexican border. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Santos demanded to know why I wanted to go away from help, away from our families, away from everything familiar. Miguel pointed out that the Mexican coast was over 60 miles away, and we'd be burning fuel we couldn't afford to waste. They both thought I was panicking, making decisions based on fear instead of logic. The argument went on for 20 minutes while the ash continued to fall around us. Santos was getting more agitated by the minute, talking about his daughter and how she needed him to come home. Miguel was worried about his wife, who had asthma and might have trouble breathing if the ash got worse. Both of them made valid points, and part of me wondered if they were right. Maybe I was overreacting to what might turn out to be a minor inconvenience. But then I remembered something my uncle had told me years ago, back when I was just starting out as a fisherman. He said that the ocean talks to those who know how to listen, and when it tells you to do something, you don't argue with it. You trust your instincts and act accordingly. Right now, every instinct I had was telling me that San Diego Harbor was a trap, that the boats heading back north were making a fatal mistake. I made the decision that probably saved our lives. Despite the protests from my crew, I turned Leye Gaviota south and headed for Mexican waters. Santos called me every name in the book, saying I was risking all our lives on a hunch. Miguel just shook his head and went back to checking our equipment, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. They thought I was making the wrong choice, and maybe I was. But I'd rather be wrong and alive than right and dead. As we pulled away from our fishing spot, heading south into increasingly rough seas, I watched other boats on the horizon turning. North toward San Diego, there was the Maria Elena, the San Miguel, the Pacific Dream, and at least a dozen others I could see through the falling ash. They were all heading home to their families, to safety, to the logical choice. I wondered if I'd ever see any of them again. The radio continued to crackle with reports from around the world. Seattle was reporting 3 feet of ash accumulation and rapidly dropping temperatures. Portland's airport had shut down completely. There were reports of massive livestock die-offs across the Great Plains, where ranchers were finding cattle frozen to death in their fields. The interference was getting worse, making it harder to understand the transmissions, but what I could make out painted a picture of disaster spreading across the entire continent. By 9 o'clock, the ash had stopped falling, but the damage was done. The sky remained a sickly gray color, and the sun was nothing more than a pale disk that you could stare at directly without hurting your eyes. The temperature had dropped over 20 degrees since morning, and everything was coated in a layer of fine gray powder. Our boat looked like it had been dipped in cement, and the ash was heavy enough that I worried about the extra weight affecting our stability. Miguel was developing a cough from breathing the ash, even though we'd tried to cover our faces with bandanas. Santos was still angry about my decision to head south, but he was also starting to get scared. The radio reports were getting more dire by the hour, with mentions of something called volcanic winter that the scientists were predicting. I didn't need a college degree to understand what that meant. No sun meant no warmth, and no warmth meant everything dies. Our fish finder was showing that the ocean temperature was dropping rapidly. In the span of 3 hours, the water had cooled by 15 degrees. Fish were diving even deeper, and we weren't seeing any surface activity at all. It was like the entire ecosystem was shutting down, preparing for something catastrophic. The dolphins and other marine mammals had completely disappeared, probably heading for warmer waters hundreds of miles away. I kept thinking about the other boats that had headed back to San Diego. By now, they should have reached the harbor and been safely tied up at their docks. Their crews would be with their families, helping them prepare for whatever was coming. Maybe they'd made the right choice after all. Maybe I was leading my crew into danger instead of away from it. But something told me to keep heading south, to trust the instincts that had kept me alive for 15 years on these waters. The Coast Guard's transmissions were becoming more sporadic and harder to understand. When we could make out what they were saying, the reports were getting worse. There were mentions of emergency evacuations, of National Guard deployments, of transportation systems shutting down across the country. The ash cloud was spreading faster than anyone had predicted, and temperatures were dropping in places that had never seen snow. As we approached the 10-hour mark since the first radio alert, I realized that this wasn't just a regional disaster. This was the beginning of something that would change everything, everywhere. The world as we knew it was ending, and we were watching it happen in real time. The question now wasn't whether we'd made the right choice in heading south. The question was whether any of us would survive what was coming next. The radio crackled one more time with a transmission from the Weather Service. They were reporting that the ash cloud was now visible from space, covering most of North America and spreading rapidly across the Atlantic. Temperatures in major cities were dropping by the hour, and meteorologists were predicting that the cooling effect would last for months, possibly years. They used phrases like global climate disruption and agricultural collapse that made my blood run cold. Santos finally stopped arguing with me about our direction. He was staring at the radio with a look of absolute horror on his face, finally understanding what we were dealing with. Miguel had retreated to the cabin, his cough getting worse as the ash in the air continued to irritate his lungs. I was alone on deck, steering La Gaviota through increasingly rough seas toward a destination I wasn't even sure we could reach. The ocean around us was starting to change in ways I'd never seen before. The water was taking on a grayish tint from all the ash that had fallen into it, and the waves were moving differently, sluggishly, like the sea itself was getting sick. I could see chunks of what looked like ice floating past us, even though we were still in relatively warm waters. The whole ecosystem was collapsing in real time, and we were witnessing the death of the ocean as we knew it. As we continued south into increasingly unfamiliar waters, the reality of our situation began to sink in. The ash had stopped falling around 10 in the morning, but the sky remained that terrible gray color, like dirty concrete stretched across the entire horizon. The sun was barely visible through the haze, a weak pale circle that gave off almost no warmth. I'd been checking our instruments every few minutes, and the air temperature had dropped another 15 degrees since we'd started our journey south. Miguel's cough was getting worse by the hour. He'd retreated to the small cabin below deck, trying to escape the ash particles that were still floating in the air. Every few minutes, I could hear him having a coughing fit that sounded like it was tearing his lungs apart. Santos kept checking on him, bringing him water and trying to get him to eat something, but Miguel could barely keep anything down. The ash was doing something to his respiratory system, and we didn't have the medical supplies to treat it properly. Our little medical kit contained basic first aid supplies, bandages, antiseptic, and some over-the-counter medications, but nothing for serious respiratory distress. I'd always figured that if someone got seriously hurt, we'd be able to radio for help or head back to port quickly. Now I was realizing how limited our options were when the entire world was falling apart around us. The medical supplies I'd always kept stocked were going to run out fast if Miguel's condition didn't improve. The radio was becoming increasingly unreliable. Every few minutes, we'd catch fragments of transmissions from around the world, but most of it was drowned out by static and interference. What we could hear was terrifying. London was reporting temperatures dropping below freezing for the first time in October in recorded history. Tokyo was dealing with ash accumulation that was shutting down their transportation systems. Mexico City was experiencing snow, actual snow, in a city that never saw temperatures below 40 degrees. Santos was trying to call his daughter Maria again, but the cell towers were either down or overloaded. When he finally got through around noon, the conversation was brief and filled with static. She told him that San Diego was in chaos, that the ash had turned the city into something that looked like a black and white photograph. People were being told to stay indoors, and the emergency services were overwhelmed. She sounded terrified, and when the call cut out, Santos just sat there staring at his phone with tears in his eyes. I was starting to doubt my decision to head south. Maybe Santos and Miguel had been right. Maybe we should have gone back to San Diego Harbor while we still had the chance. At least there, we'd be closer to help, closer to our families, closer to whatever resources the government might be able to provide. Out here in the middle of the Pacific, we were completely on our own, and our supplies were limited. We had enough food for maybe 3 days, enough water for 2 if we were careful, and enough fuel to get us to the Mexican coast if nothing went wrong. The ocean itself was starting to look different. The water had taken on a grayish tint from all the ash that had fallen into it, and there were strange currents that I'd never encountered before. The fish finder was showing that the water temperature was dropping rapidly, much faster than should have been possible. In the span of 4 hours, the ocean had cooled by over 20 degrees. The marine life was responding by diving deeper and deeper, trying to find warmer water at the bottom of the sea. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we started seeing chunks of ice floating past us. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, because ice doesn't form in Southern California waters, especially not in October. But there they were, small pieces of ice no bigger than dinner plates, bobbing in the waves around our boat. Santos pointed them out too, so I knew I wasn't imagining things. The ocean was actually starting to freeze, even though we were still hundreds of miles from any place that should have been cold enough for ice formation. The engine was starting to show signs of strain. The ash that had fallen earlier was getting sucked into the air intake, clogging the filters and making the motor work harder than it should. I could hear it coughing and sputtering occasionally, like it was having trouble getting enough clean air to run properly. Miguel, despite his own breathing problems, crawled out of the cabin to help me check the engine. He confirmed what I already suspected. If we couldn't clean the ash out of the system, the engine would fail completely within a few hours. We didn't have spare air filters, and the ones we had were already so clogged with ash that cleaning them would be a temporary fix at best. Miguel suggested we could try to rig something using cloth or paper to filter the air, but that would only buy us a little time. Eventually, the engine would fail, and we'd be dead in the water. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were over 40 miles from shore, in rapidly cooling water, with an engine that was slowly dying. Santos was monitoring the radio when we heard something that made our blood run cold. A fishing boat called the Santa Rosa was calling for help, about 20 miles north of our position. They were reporting that their engine had failed, and they were taking on water in the rough seas. The captain sounded desperate, saying they had 4 men on board and their emergency beacon wasn't working. The Coast Guard's response was barely audible through the static, but what we could make out wasn't encouraging. They were telling the Santa Rosa that rescue operations were suspended due to the weather conditions. Miguel and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. We were probably the closest vessel to the Santa Rosa, and if anyone was going to help them, it would have to be us. But heading north to attempt a rescue would take us away from our destination, burn precious fuel, and put us in even more danger. Our own engine was failing, and we barely had enough supplies to keep ourselves alive. Taking on 4 more people would stretch our resources to the breaking point. Santos made the decision for us. He grabbed the radio and told the Santa Rosa that we were heading their way. I wanted to argue with him, to point out that we were barely surviving ourselves, but when I looked at his face, I knew there was no point. These were fellow fishermen in trouble, and Santos wasn't going to leave them to die if there was anything we could do about it. Miguel nodded his agreement. Despite his deteriorating condition, we were going to attempt a rescue. Changing course to head north toward the Santa Rosa's position was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made. Every instinct told me we should keep heading south, that we couldn't afford to waste fuel and time on a rescue mission that might fail. But I also knew that if we were in their position, we'd want someone to try to help us. The ocean has its own code of honor, and abandoning fellow fishermen in distress wasn't something any of us could live with. The seas were getting rougher as we headed north, with waves that were larger and more chaotic than anything I'd experienced in these waters before. The changing water temperature was affecting the current patterns, creating unpredictable swells that made navigation difficult. Our boat was taking a beating, and I could hear equipment shifting around below deck with each wave. The ice chunks floating past us were getting larger and more frequent, some of them big enough to damage our hull if we hit them wrong. It took us over an hour to reach the Santa Rosa's last known position, and when we finally spotted them, the situation was worse than I'd imagined. Their boat was listing badly to one side, taking on water faster than they could pump it out. The four-man crew was wearing life jackets and looked ready to abandon ship. Their captain, a man named Rodriguez who I'd met a few times at the harbor, waved frantically when he saw us approaching. Getting close enough to the Santa Rosa to transfer their crew was incredibly dangerous. The waves were pushing both boats around like toys, and one wrong move could result in a collision that would sink both vessels. Miguel, despite his breathing problems, helped me maneuver La Gaviota into position while Santos prepared to take on the other crew. It was a delicate operation that required perfect timing and a lot of luck. The rescue took almost 2 hours, and by the time we had all 4 men from the Santa Rosa safely on board, our fuel reserves were running critically low. Rodriguez and his crew were grateful but also terrified. They'd been monitoring the radio and had heard reports that were even worse than what we'd been receiving. According to their information, the entire West Coast was experiencing unprecedented weather conditions, with temperatures dropping so fast that emergency services were overwhelmed. Having 8 people on a boat designed for 3 was challenging enough, but Rodriguez brought news that made our situation even more desperate. He'd been in contact with other fishing vessels before his radio failed, and according to what he'd heard, the boats that had returned to San Diego Harbor were in serious trouble. The harbor was starting to freeze over, trapping vessels in ice. That was forming faster than anyone thought possible. The information Rodriguez shared made me realize that my decision to head south might have been the right one after all. The boats that had gone back to San Diego, including the Maria Elena, the San Miguel, and the Pacific Dream, were now trapped in ice that was several inches thick and getting thicker by the hour. The crews were stuck on their boats, unable to reach shore, with no way to get supplies or help. Some of them were already reporting that their heating systems were failing and their food supplies were running low. Santos was devastated by this news. He'd been hoping that the other boats had made it safely back to port, where their crews could be with their families during this crisis. Instead, they were trapped in what was essentially a frozen prison, possibly worse off than we were. The guilt was eating at him, and I could see him struggling with the knowledge that his friends and fellow fishermen were in mortal danger. Miguel's condition was getting worse, and now we had 4 additional people to worry about. Rodriguez and his crew were experienced fishermen, but they were also shaken by their near-death experience and the apocalyptic conditions we were all facing. Our food supplies, which had been adequate for 3 people for a few days, were now stretched to feed 8 people for an unknown period of time. The water situation was even more critical, and we were going to have to start rationing immediately. The engine was struggling more with each passing hour. The ash in the air intake was causing it to run rough and lose power, and I could smell something burning in the engine compartment. Miguel tried to help me diagnose the problem, but his coughing fits were getting so severe that he could barely speak. Rodriguez, who had some mechanical experience, took a look at the engine and confirmed what I already knew. We were looking at complete engine failure within a few hours. As evening approached, the temperature dropped even further. Ice was forming on the deck of our boat, making it slippery and dangerous to walk around. The chunks of ice floating past us were getting bigger, some of them the size of small cars. The ocean itself was starting to freeze, something that should have been impossible in these waters. We were witnessing the death of the Pacific as we knew it, and we were right in the middle of it. The radio brought more devastating news as the sun set behind the gray, ash-filled sky. Reports from around the world painted a picture of complete climate collapse. The ash cloud from Yellowstone had spread across the entire northern hemisphere, blocking sunlight and causing temperatures to plummet everywhere. Agricultural regions that fed millions of people were experiencing killing frosts that would destroy entire harvests. Transportation systems were shutting down as ice and snow made roads impassable. Santos tried one more time to reach his daughter Maria, but the cell towers were either down or completely overloaded. When he finally got through, the call lasted only a few seconds before cutting out. All he could make out was that she was safe for now, but that the situation in San Diego was deteriorating rapidly. The power grid was failing, and people were being moved to emergency shelters. The brief conversation ended abruptly, leaving Santos not knowing if he'd ever hear from his daughter again. Rodriguez shared what he'd heard about the military response to the crisis. According to the reports his crew had been monitoring, the National Guard was being deployed to major cities, but they were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. There were mentions of emergency evacuation procedures, but the transportation systems needed to move people were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The government was essentially helpless in the face of a disaster this large and this fast-moving. The first night after the rescue was the longest of my life. The temperature dropped below freezing, something that had never happened in these waters in recorded history. Ice formed on every surface of our boat, making it treacherous to move around. We huddled together in the small cabin, sharing body heat and trying to conserve what little fuel we had left for the heater. 8 grown men crammed into a space designed for 3, listening to the ocean freeze around us. Miguel's breathing got so bad during the night that we thought we were going to lose him. His lungs were so damaged by the ash that he couldn't get enough oxygen, and his lips were turning blue. Rodriguez and his crew helped us try to make him comfortable, but there wasn't much we could do without proper medical equipment. The sound of his labored breathing filled the cabin, a constant reminder of how precarious our situation had become. The radio continued to bring reports of disaster from around the world throughout the night. Cities that had never seen snow were reporting blizzard conditions. The ash cloud was continuing to spread, and meteorologists were predicting that the cooling effect would last for months or possibly years. They were using terms like nuclear winter and mass extinction event that made it clear this wasn't just a temporary crisis. Santos spent the night staring at his phone, hoping for another call from Maria that never came. The cell towers were failing one by one, and even if they'd been working, the battery in his phone was almost dead. We had no way to charge it, and no way to know if our families were safe. The isolation was almost as terrifying as the physical dangers we were facing. Around 3 in the morning, we heard something that made our blood run cold. The sound of ice cracking and groaning filled the air around us, like the ocean itself was in pain. Large sheets of ice were forming on the surface, and they were colliding with each other, creating a cacophony of destruction that echoed across the water. The ocean was freezing so fast that the ice didn't have time to form smoothly, instead creating a chaotic landscape of broken sheets and jagged edges. The engine finally gave out completely just before dawn. 1 minute it was running rough but still functioning, and the next minute it seized up entirely. The smell of burning oil filled the cabin, and I knew immediately that we weren't going to be able to fix it. We were now dead in the water, drifting at the mercy of currents that were becoming increasingly unpredictable as the ocean continued to freeze around us. Rodriguez and his crew helped me try to diagnose the engine problem, but it was clear that the damage was too severe to repair with the tools and parts we had available. The ash had clogged every filter and intake, and the extreme cold had caused seals and gaskets to fail. We were looking at a complete engine rebuild, which was impossible under our current circumstances. Our boat had become little more than a floating iceberg, drifting toward an uncertain fate. As the second day since the Yellowstone eruption began, we found ourselves in a situation that was beyond anything I'd ever imagined. We were trapped on a disabled boat in freezing water, with limited food and water, and no way to call for help. The ocean around us was turning into a frozen wasteland, and we were right in the middle of it. The decisions we'd made in the past 24 hours had brought us to this point, and now we had to figure out how to survive what was coming next. The current was pushing us toward the Mexican coast, But at our current rate of drift, it would take days to reach shore. Days we didn't have, with our limited supplies and Miguel's deteriorating condition. I was beginning to realize that our next decisions would determine whether we lived or died, and the margin for error was getting smaller with each passing hour. The ocean that had been my livelihood for 15 years was now trying to kill us, and I wasn't sure we had the strength to fight back. By dawn of the second day, Miguel was barely conscious. The ash poisoning had ravaged his respiratory system, to the point where every breath was a struggle. His lips had turned a deep blue color, and his skin was pale and clammy despite the freezing temperatures around us. Rodriguez and I took turns holding him upright, trying to help him breathe, but we all knew he needed medical attention that we simply couldn't provide. The sound of his labored breathing filled our cramped cabin, a constant reminder that we were watching a good man slowly dying. Santos was struggling with more than just Miguel's condition. The guilt over our situation was eating him alive, and he kept blaming himself for insisting we attempt the rescue of Rodriguez's crew. In his mind, if we'd kept heading south with our original supplies and fuel, we might have reached safety by now. Instead, we were drifting helplessly with 8 people, limited resources, and a dying friend. Every few minutes he'd mutter apologies to Miguel, promising that we'd get him help somehow, even though we all knew that wasn't possible. Rodriguez tried to help me assess our situation objectively. We had enough food for maybe 2 more days, if we rationed carefully, and enough water for perhaps 1 day if we were extremely conservative. The heater was draining our battery faster than I'd anticipated, but without it, we'd all freeze to death within hours. The ice forming on the outside of our cabin was already several inches thick, and I could hear it creaking and groaning as it expanded. Our boat was slowly being crushed by the very ocean that had once provided our living. The radio was still picking up fragmentary transmissions from around the world, and what we heard was beyond comprehension. The entire northern hemisphere was experiencing the most rapid climate change in recorded history. Cities that had never seen snow were buried under feet of ice and ash. Agricultural regions that fed millions were experiencing complete crop failures. The global economy was collapsing as transportation systems shut down and supply chains broke apart. We were witnessing the end of civilization as we knew it, and we were trapped in the middle of it. Around 10 in the morning, Santos completely broke down. He started crying uncontrollably, talking about his daughter Maria and how he'd never see her again. He kept saying that he should have insisted we go back to San Diego, that at least then he could have died with his family instead of out here in the middle of nowhere. Rodriguez and his crew tried to comfort him, but Santos was beyond consolation. The stress of our situation, combined with the guilt over Miguel's condition and worry about his daughter, had pushed him past his breaking point. I had to make a decision about leadership. With Santos having a mental breakdown and Miguel barely alive, the responsibility for keeping everyone together fell on my shoulders. Rodriguez was experienced and capable, but he was dealing with his own trauma from losing his boat and nearly drowning. His 3 crew members were young and scared, looking to the older men for guidance. I realized that despite my own fears and doubts, I had to project confidence and keep everyone focused on survival. The engine compartment was filled with frozen seawater that had somehow gotten into the bilge system. The extreme cold had caused pipes to burst and seals to fail throughout the boat. Even if we'd had the parts to repair the engine, the ice damage to the boat systems was so extensive that we'd need a shipyard to fix everything. La Gaviota was dying around us, slowly succumbing to the unnatural conditions that were destroying everything we'd once taken for granted. Miguel's condition took a turn for the worse around noon. He started coughing up blood, and his breathing became so shallow that we thought each breath might be his last. Santos, despite his own emotional state, crawled over to hold Miguel's hand and talk to him about their families. Miguel tried to speak, but all that came out were gasps and whispers. He managed to tell us about his wife Carmen and how much he loved her, how proud he was of his kids, and how he wanted us to tell them what happened to him if we ever made it back. Rodriguez shared information he'd been holding back about the scope of the disaster. Before his radio had failed completely, he'd heard reports from commercial vessels around the world. Ships in the North Atlantic were reporting ice formations in areas that should have been ice-free year-round. Cargo vessels in the Pacific were being rerouted as shipping lanes became impassable due to rapidly forming ice fields. The global shipping industry, which moved most of the world's food and goods, was grinding to a halt. The psychological impact of our situation was becoming as dangerous as the physical threats. Being trapped in a small space with 8 people, watching a friend die slowly, knowing that our families were in danger, and facing our own mortality was pushing everyone to their limits. Rodriguez's youngest crew member, a kid named Pablo who couldn't have been more than 20, started having panic attacks. The older men tried to keep him calm, but we were all struggling with the same fears and doubts. Around 2 in the afternoon, we heard something that gave us the first glimmer of hope we'd had in days. The radio crackled to life with a transmission from what sounded like a Mexican naval vessel. The signal was weak and filled with static, but we could make out that they were conducting search and rescue operations along the coast. They were looking for survivors from vessels that had been caught in the rapidly changing conditions. Rodriguez grabbed the radio and tried to respond, but our transmitter was too weak to reach them. The realization that help might be nearby, but just out of reach, was almost worse than having no hope at all. We could hear the Mexican naval vessel making contact with other survivors, coordinating rescue efforts, and providing hope to people in situations similar to ours. But we couldn't reach them, couldn't let them know where we were, couldn't ask for help. Our radio had enough power to receive transmissions, but not enough to send them over any significant distance. Miguel died at 3:15 in the afternoon of the second day. His breathing just stopped, quietly and peacefully, while Santos was holding his hand and talking to him about the good times they'd shared fishing together. One moment he was struggling for each breath, and the next moment he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Miguel had been the most experienced fisherman among us, the one who knew these waters better than anyone else, and now he was dead from breathing volcanic ash. Santos completely fell apart after Miguel's death. He blamed himself for everything that had happened, convinced that if he'd made different decisions, Miguel would still be alive. He kept saying that we should have gone back to San Diego, that at least there Miguel could have gotten medical help. Rodriguez and I tried to explain that the boats that went back were trapped in ice and probably in worse shape than we were. But Santos wasn't listening to reason anymore. We had to make the difficult decision about what to do with Miguel's body. The cabin was too small to keep him with us, but the idea of putting him overboard felt like a betrayal of everything he'd meant to us. Rodriguez suggested that we wrap him in blankets and put him on the deck, where the cold would preserve him until we could give him a proper burial. It was a compromise that nobody was happy with, but it was the best we could do under the circumstances. The ice around our boat was getting thicker and more dangerous by the hour. What had started as small chunks floating past us had become large sheets of ice that were connecting and forming a solid surface. We were in danger of being completely trapped, frozen into the ice like the boats back in San Diego Harbor. The difference was that we were miles from shore, with no hope of rescue if we became completely immobilized. Rodriguez and I started working on a plan to escape the encroaching ice. The current was still pushing us generally toward the Mexican coast, but slowly and unpredictably. If we could find a way to break free from the ice that was forming around us, we might be able to drift close enough to shore to attempt a landing. It was a long shot, but it was better than sitting still and waiting to be frozen in place. The boat's small inflatable life raft was still functional, though we hadn't deployed it yet. Rodriguez suggested that we might be able to use it to ferry people to shore once we got close enough to the coastline. The raft was rated for 6 people, which meant we'd have to make multiple trips or risk overloading it. With the water temperature below freezing, anyone who went into the ocean would have only minutes before hypothermia set in. Santos was getting worse by the hour. He'd stopped eating entirely and was just sitting in the corner of the cabin, staring at nothing and occasionally talking to people who weren't there. He kept having conversations with his daughter Maria, telling her he was sorry for not coming home, promising he'd be there soon. The stress and grief had pushed him into some kind of psychological break that was making him increasingly disconnected from reality. The radio brought news that made our situation even more desperate. We heard reports that the Mexican coast was being overwhelmed with refugees from the disaster, and that their naval forces were stretched thin trying to rescue survivors. The infrastructure along the border was breaking down as hundreds of thousands of people tried to flee south to escape the rapidly deteriorating conditions in the United States. Even if we reached the coast, we might not find the help and resources we were hoping for. Rodriguez shared something he'd been thinking about since Miguel's death. He pointed out that with our limited supplies and 8 people to feed, we were all going to die within a few days anyway. The only chance any of us had was to make difficult decisions about who had the best chance of survival, and focus our remaining resources on getting those people to safety. It was a conversation nobody wanted to have, but the mathematics of our situation were becoming undeniable. Pablo, the youngest member of Rodriguez's crew, was showing signs of hypothermia despite our best efforts to keep everyone warm. His fingers and toes were turning white, and he was becoming increasingly confused and disoriented. We wrapped him in every spare piece of clothing we could find, but without proper medical treatment, he was going to lose digits to frostbite at minimum. The cold was slowly killing all of us, just at different rates. The ice formations around us were creating strange acoustic effects. We could hear the ocean groaning and cracking for miles in every direction, like the planet itself was in pain. The sound was constant and unnerving, a reminder that we were witnessing something that had never happened before in human history. The Pacific Ocean was freezing solid, and we were trapped in the middle of it with no way out. Around 6 in the evening, we finally made contact with the Mexican naval vessel we'd been hearing on the radio. Our signal was weak, but Rodriguez managed to get through long enough to give them our approximate position and let them know we had casualties. The response was not encouraging. They told us they were aware of our situation but were dealing with hundreds of similar emergencies along the coast. They couldn't promise when or if they'd be able to reach us. The realization that we were essentially on our own was sobering. Even if rescue forces knew where we were, they were too overwhelmed to help us immediately. We had to find a way to save ourselves, or we were all going to die out there in the frozen Pacific. The boat that had been my livelihood for 15 years was becoming our tomb, and I was running out of ideas for how to prevent that from happening. Santos made a decision that terrified all of us. He announced that he was going to try to walk across the ice to reach shore. The ice sheets around us looked solid enough to support a person's weight, and he was convinced that he could make it to the coast on foot. Rodriguez and I tried to talk him out of it, explaining that the ice was unstable and that he'd freeze to death within hours of leaving the boat. But Santos wasn't thinking rationally anymore. He was consumed with guilt over Miguel's death and desperate to reach his daughter. We couldn't physically stop Santos from leaving without risking injury to everyone involved. He was determined to attempt the impossible walk across miles of unstable ice to reach a shore that might not even be accessible. Rodriguez and I watched helplessly as Santos gathered what little gear he could carry and prepared to leave the relative safety of our boat for the certain death that awaited him on the ice. The man who had been my friend and crew member for years was about to commit suicide, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. The weight of leadership was crushing me. I had to make decisions about who lived and who died, who got the limited food and water, who got to use the life raft if we reached shore. Miguel was already dead, Santos was having a complete mental breakdown, and Pablo was showing signs of severe hypothermia. Rodriguez and his remaining crew members were looking to me for answers I didn't have. The ocean that had been my home for 15 years was now my enemy, and I was losing the battle to keep my people alive. Santos left our boat at 7 in the evening, just as the sun was setting behind the ash-filled sky. Despite all our arguments and pleas, he was determined to walk across the ice to reach shore and somehow get back to his daughter, Maria. The last thing he said to me was that Miguel's death was his fault, and he couldn't live with the guilt of making decisions that killed good people. Rodriguez and I watched him disappear into the gray twilight, stepping carefully from one ice sheet to another, carrying nothing but a backpack with some food and water. We all knew we'd never see him again. The silence after Santos left was overwhelming. Our group had gone from 8 people to 6 in the span of a few hours, and the psychological impact was devastating. Pablo was still showing signs of hypothermia, his speech slurred and his movements increasingly uncoordinated. Rodriguez's other 2 crew members, Carlos and David, were handling the stress better, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They were looking at me for leadership and answers I wasn't sure I had. Without Santos to help navigate our group dynamics, Rodriguez and I had to establish a new hierarchy quickly. We divided the remaining food and water into strict rations. That might keep us alive for 2 more days if we were extremely careful. The reality was that we were all going to die out here unless we reached shore within the next 48 hours. The boat was slowly being crushed by the ice, and our supplies were running out faster than I'd calculated. The ice around us had become so thick that our boat was completely immobilized. We were trapped in what had essentially become a frozen lake miles from shore, with no engine and no way to break free. The ice was making constant creaking, groaning sounds as it expanded and contracted with the changing temperatures. Every few minutes, we'd hear a loud crack as a new fissure opened somewhere in the ice field, reminding us how unstable our frozen prison really was. Rodriguez shared something that changed everything. Before his boat had gone down, he'd been monitoring emergency frequencies and had heard about a network of survival caches that families along the Mexican coast maintained for hurricane season. These caches contained food, water, medical supplies, and communication equipment, hidden in locations known only to local fishing families. Santos had mentioned something about his extended family keeping a cache near a small village called Puerto Escondido, about 30 miles south of our current position. The possibility that there might be a stocked survival cache somewhere within reach gave us our first real hope since Miguel's death. Rodriguez thought he could remember some of the details Santos had shared about the location. It was supposedly hidden in a cave system near the beach, marked by 3 white stones arranged in a triangle. The cache was designed to support a family for several weeks during a major hurricane, which meant it might have everything we needed to survive until proper rescue arrived. Pablo's condition was deteriorating rapidly despite our efforts to keep him warm. His fingers and toes had turned black from frostbite, and he was becoming increasingly delirious. He kept talking about his mother and asking when we were going home, seemingly unaware that we were trapped in the middle of a frozen ocean. Rodriguez and I knew that Pablo needed immediate medical attention that we couldn't provide, and that he probably wouldn't survive another night in these conditions. Around 9 in the evening, we heard something that gave us hope and terror in equal measure. The radio crackled to life with a transmission from what sounded like an aircraft, possibly a helicopter or small plane conducting search and rescue operations. The pilot was reporting multiple survivor groups along the coast and requesting coordinates for supply drops. Rodriguez grabbed the radio and tried to respond, but our signal was too weak to reach them. We could hear salvation flying overhead, but we couldn't call out to it. The frustration of being so close to rescue, but unable to communicate, was almost unbearable. We listened to the aircraft coordinating with ground teams, discussing the locations of survivor camps and the logistics of getting supplies to people in need. They were operating out of a base somewhere inland, probably a Mexican military installation that had been converted to a refugee coordination center. But without a stronger radio transmitter, we might as well have been on another planet. Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. He announced that he was going to attempt to reach shore using the inflatable life raft. The ice field extended for miles in every direction, but there were channels of open water where the current had prevented complete freezing. If he could navigate the raft through these channels, he might be able to reach the coast and then guide rescue teams back to our location. It was incredibly dangerous, but it was better than sitting still and waiting to die. I wanted to go with Rodriguez, but we both knew that was impossible. Someone had to stay with Pablo and the other crew members, and the raft was too small to safely carry everyone at once. Rodriguez would go alone, traveling light and fast, with the goal of reaching shore and organizing a rescue for the rest of us. If he didn't make it, at least the rest of us would still have the raft as a backup option. Preparing Rodriguez for his journey took most of the night. We gathered what little survival gear we had, including the emergency flares, a compass, some food and water, and the strongest flashlight we could find. The water temperature was below freezing, so if Rodriguez went into the ocean, he'd have maybe 5 minutes before hypothermia rendered him helpless. The inflatable raft wasn't designed for these conditions, but it was the only option we had. Carlos and David helped us deploy the life raft just before dawn. The process was incredibly difficult because of the ice surrounding our boat, and we had to break through several inches of frozen surface to reach water deep enough to float the raft. The sound of ice breaking echoed across the frozen landscape, and I worried that we might be creating instability that could trap Rodriguez before he even started his journey. Rodriguez climbed into the raft at first light, carrying nothing but essential survival gear and the hope that he could somehow reach civilization. The last thing he said to me was that if he didn't make it back within 24 hours, I should assume he was dead and make whatever decisions were necessary to save the remaining survivors. I watched him paddle away through the narrow channel of open water, disappearing into the gray morning haze that had become our permanent sky. Pablo died 2 hours after Rodriguez left. His hypothermia had progressed to the point where his body simply couldn't function anymore, and he slipped away quietly while Carlos was trying to get him to drink some water. We'd lost 3 people in less than 24 hours, and the psychological impact on Carlos and David was devastating. They were both young men who'd never experienced anything like this, and watching their friends die was breaking them down mentally. The boat was making concerning sounds as the ice continued to expand around us. I could hear metal groaning and creaking as the hull was slowly compressed by the frozen water. Our cabin was developing small cracks where the pressure was concentrating, and I was worried that the boat might actually break apart if the ice kept expanding. We were racing against time in multiple ways, running out of food and water while our shelter was literally being crushed around us. Carlos shared something that Pablo had told him before he died. Apparently, Pablo's family lived in a coastal village about 50 miles south of our position, and they had experience dealing with extreme weather events. According to Pablo, his grandfather had survived a major hurricane in the 1970s by taking shelter in a network of natural caves that ran along the coastline. These caves were above the high tide line but close enough to the ocean that they stayed warm even in cold weather. The information about the cave system gave me an idea that might save our lives. If Rodriguez made it to shore and found the survival cache that Santos had mentioned, he might also be able to locate these natural shelters that Pablo's family had used. Caves would provide protection from the wind and cold, and if they were large enough, they could house multiple survivor groups until proper rescue arrived. It was another long shot, but it was better than freezing to death on a slowly disintegrating boat. Around noon, we heard the aircraft again, this time much closer to our position. The pilot was communicating with ground teams about a large group of survivors who had been spotted near the coast. The radio traffic suggested that rescue operations were expanding, with more aircraft and boats being deployed to search for people trapped by the rapidly changing conditions. The Mexican government was apparently coordinating with American authorities to manage the massive refugee crisis developing along the border. David surprised me by revealing that he had some mechanical experience beyond just fishing. Before he'd started working on boats, he'd been trained as an automotive technician, and he thought he might be able to jury-rig something that could boost our radio signal. The idea was to use parts from the boat's electrical system to create a more powerful transmitter that could reach the rescue aircraft. It was a complicated process that would require dismantling other systems, but it might be our only chance to call for help. Working on the radio modification took most of the afternoon, and the process was made more difficult by the cramped conditions and the fact that our hands were nearly numb from the cold. David and I took apart the boat's navigation lights and depth finder, trying to salvage components that could be used to amplify our transmission power. Carlos helped by holding flashlights and keeping track of the small parts that we couldn't afford to lose. The improvised radio modification worked better than I dared to hope. When we tested it around 4 in the afternoon, we were able to reach a Mexican Coast Guard station that was coordinating rescue operations along the affected coastline. The operator spoke English and was able to record our position and the details of our situation. They confirmed that Rodriguez had been picked up earlier that day and was safe at a refugee processing center about 40 miles inland. Learning that Rodriguez had made it to safety was the first good news we'd received in days. The Coast Guard operator told us that Rodriguez had already provided them with our location and the details of our situation. A rescue helicopter was being dispatched to our position, but the extreme weather conditions were making flight operations difficult and dangerous. They couldn't promise when the helicopter would arrive, but they assured us that rescue was coming. The psychological impact of knowing that help was on the way was enormous. Carlos and David, who had been barely holding themselves together after watching 3 friends die, suddenly had hope again. We still had to survive until the rescue helicopter arrived, but at least we knew that we weren't going to die forgotten and alone in the middle of a frozen ocean. The radio contact also meant that our families would eventually learn what had happened to us. Around 6 in the evening, we heard the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The aircraft was flying a search pattern, probably looking for the GPS coordinates we'd provided to the Coast Guard. David and I fired off our emergency flares, sending bright red streaks into the gray sky. The helicopter pilot spotted our signals immediately and began approaching our position, but the ice field made landing impossible. The rescue operation was more complicated than I'd anticipated. The helicopter couldn't land on the unstable ice, so they had to lower a rescue basket from a hover position about 50 feet above our boat. The downdraft from the rotors was creating a whirlwind of ice crystals and ash that made it difficult to see, and the basket was swinging wildly in the turbulent air. Getting into that basket while it was moving required perfect timing and a lot of courage. Carlos went up first, and the process took almost 10 minutes of careful coordination between the helicopter crew and those of us on the boat. David went next, and then it was my turn to climb into the rescue basket and be lifted away from La Gaviota. Looking down at my boat as the helicopter carried me to safety, I could see that the ice had completely crushed the hull. If we'd waited another few hours, the boat would have collapsed entirely and probably taken us with it. The helicopter took us to a temporary landing zone that had been set up at a school about 20 miles inland from the coast. The facility had been converted into a refugee processing center where survivors were being given medical attention, food, and temporary shelter. The Mexican authorities had mobilized an impressive response to the crisis, working around the clock to rescue people and provide basic necessities. Rodriguez was waiting for us when we arrived, and the reunion was emotional for everyone involved. The medical examination revealed just how close we'd all come to death. Carlos and David both had early-stage hypothermia and frostbite on their fingers and toes. I was suffering from dehydration and exhaustion, but otherwise in relatively good shape. The medical staff told us that we'd probably survived only because we'd stayed together and shared body heat in the boat's cabin. If we'd been separated or exposed to the elements for much longer, we would have died. The refugee center was filled with hundreds of people who had similar stories of survival and loss. Families had been separated, boats had been destroyed, and entire communities along the coast had been evacuated. The staff was doing their best to help everyone, but the scale of the disaster was overwhelming their resources. People were sleeping on cots in the gymnasium, sharing meals in the cafeteria, and waiting in long lines to use the few working telephone lines to contact relatives. Rodriguez and I were eventually able to call our families and let them know we were alive. My conversation with my sister was brief but emotional. She told me that San Diego was completely shut down, that the harbor was frozen solid, and that many of the fishing boats that had returned there were trapped in ice. The crews were being evacuated to emergency shelters, but the situation was chaotic and dangerous. She'd been afraid that I was dead, trapped somewhere in the frozen Pacific. Learning about the fate of the boats that had returned to San Diego Harbor was sobering. The Maria Elena, the San Miguel, the Pacific Dream, and all the other vessels that had headed north when the ash started falling were now trapped in ice that was several feet thick. Some of the crews had been rescued, but others were still trapped on their boats, waiting for ice-cutting equipment to free them. My decision to head south, which had seemed crazy at the time, had probably saved our lives. The survival cache that Santos had mentioned was real, and it had been discovered by another group of survivors who had made it to shore. The cache contained enough supplies to support a dozen people for several weeks, including medical equipment that had saved the lives of several refugees. Rodriguez and I learned that Santos's knowledge of these hidden resources had indirectly helped other people survive, even though he hadn't lived to see it himself. As night fell on our first day of safety, I reflected on everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. We'd lost Miguel to ash poisoning, Santos to guilt and desperation, and Pablo to hypothermia. 3 good men had died because of decisions I'd made as captain of La Gaviota. But Carlos David Rodriguez and I were alive, and we'd been reunited with rescue operations that were helping thousands of other survivors. The refugee center staff told us that this was just the beginning of a much larger crisis. The ash cloud from Yellowstone was continuing to spread around the world, and the cooling effect was going to last for months or possibly years. Entire regions that had once been habitable were becoming uninhabitable, and millions of people were going to be displaced. The world as we'd known it was ending, and we were among the first refugees of a new ice age. But we were alive, and that was something. The decisions I'd made as captain had been based on instinct and luck as much as skill and experience. The ocean that had tried to kill us was still out there, frozen and hostile, but we'd escaped it. Now we had to figure out how to live in a world that was fundamentally different from the one we'd known just a few days earlier. The refugee center buzzed with activity throughout the night as more survivors arrived from the frozen coastline. Around 2 in the morning, a convoy of military trucks brought in nearly 50 people who had been rescued from various locations along the beach. Among them was a family I recognized from the San Diego fishing community, the Hernanzes, who owned a small boat repair shop near the harbor. Their story was similar to ours, but with a tragic twist. They had tried to drive south when the ash started falling, but their car had broken down just north of the border. They'd spent 2 days walking through increasingly harsh conditions before Mexican authorities found them. Maria Hernandez told me something that made my blood run cold. Before they'd abandoned their car, they had seen lights in the distance that they thought were other vehicles. When they investigated, they found Santos. He was sitting beside a road, already dead from hypothermia, still clutching the photograph of his daughter that he always carried in his wallet. The Mexican soldiers who found the Hernandez family had also recovered Santos's body and brought it to a morgue that had been set up at a nearby church. At least now I knew what had happened to him, and I could eventually tell Maria what her father had tried to do. Rodriguez and I spent the early morning hours talking to other survivors, trying to piece together what was happening in the wider world. A truck driver from Phoenix told us that the entire city had been evacuated after temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for 3 straight days. A family from Los Angeles described their neighborhood being buried under 2 feet of ash, making it impossible to drive or even walk outside safely. Every story we heard reinforced how lucky we had been to escape when we did. Around dawn, a Mexican military officer approached Rodriguez and me with a proposition that would change everything. Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez was coordinating refugee operations for the entire region, and he was looking for people with maritime experience to help with ongoing rescue operations. Hundreds of people were still trapped along the coast, many of them on boats or in coastal communities that had been cut off by the ice. They needed captains and crew members who could navigate the treacherous conditions and help guide rescue operations. The decision to volunteer for rescue operations wasn't easy. Carlos and David wanted to stay at the refugee center, where they felt safe and could begin processing the trauma of everything we'd been through. I understood their choice completely. They were young men who had watched their friends die and barely survived themselves. They needed time to heal, both physically and mentally. But Rodriguez and I felt obligated to help other people who were in the same desperate situation we had just escaped. Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez explained that the rescue operations were being conducted using a combination of helicopters, ice-breaking boats, and ground teams. The Mexican Navy had managed to keep several vessels operational in the warmer waters further south, and they were using these ships as mobile bases for helicopter operations. People with experience in cold water rescue and navigation were desperately needed to guide these operations and help coordinate with survivor groups. Before we left the refugee center, I had a chance to call my sister again and get more details about what was happening in San Diego. The situation there was worse than I had imagined. The entire city was essentially shut down, with power grids failing and water systems frozen. The boats that had returned to the harbor were still trapped in ice that was now over 6 feet thick. Several crews had died from carbon monoxide poisoning when they tried to run their engines for heat in enclosed spaces. My sister also told me something that validated every decision I had made over the past 3 days. The boats that had tried to stay in San Diego waters, including some that had been anchored outside the harbor when the ice formed, were now completely unreachable. The Coast Guard had given up trying to rescue them because the ice was too thick and unstable for surface operations. The crews of those boats had been written off as casualties, lost to the same frozen ocean that had nearly claimed us. Rodriguez and I were transported by helicopter to a Mexican naval vessel called the Revolucion, which was operating about 100 miles south of our original fishing grounds. The ship had been converted into a floating rescue coordination center with additional communication equipment and helicopter landing platforms. The crew was a mix of Mexican naval personnel and civilian volunteers, including several American Coast Guard officers who had been evacuated from San Diego when their base became inoperable. The scope of the rescue operations was staggering. The naval officers showed us charts that indicated the locations of over 300 known survivor groups along the affected coastline. These ranged from single individuals to entire communities that had been cut off when roads became impassable. The ice field extended over 200 miles inland in some areas, creating a frozen wasteland where nothing could survive without proper shelter and supplies. Captain Morales, the commanding officer of the Revolucion, explained that our role would be to accompany helicopter crews on rescue missions, using our knowledge of local waters and weather patterns to help navigate the dangerous conditions. The helicopter pilots were skilled, but most of them had never operated in Arctic conditions before. They needed guides who understood how ice formations affected air currents and visibility, and how to identify safe landing zones in rapidly changing conditions. Our first rescue mission launched at 10 in the morning, targeting a group of 12 survivors who had been spotted on a small island about 30 miles north of our position. The island had been a popular fishing spot before the disaster, but now it was completely surrounded by ice and cut off from the mainland. The survivors had been there for 4 days, burning furniture from a small cabin to stay warm, but their supplies were running out fast. The helicopter flight to the island was unlike anything I had ever experienced. From the air, the frozen Pacific looked like an alien landscape, with ice formations that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Where there had once been open water, there were now jagged fields of broken ice that looked like a giant puzzle with pieces that didn't fit together. The pilot, a young Mexican Navy officer named Lieutenant Vasquez, had never seen anything like it either. Landing on the island was complicated by the fact that the normal landing zone was covered with debris that had been frozen in place when the temperature dropped. We had to clear an area by hand, working quickly because the helicopter couldn't hover indefinitely in the cold, thin air. The 12 survivors were in surprisingly good condition, considering what they had been through, but they were running low on food and had been melting ice for drinking water. The group included 2 families with young children, and getting everyone into the helicopter required careful weight and balance calculations. Children went first, then the women, then the men, with the helicopter making 2 trips to transport everyone safely. The entire operation took over 3 hours, and by the time we returned to the Revolucion, the weather was deteriorating again. More ash was falling from the sky, reducing visibility and making flight operations dangerous. Rodriguez and I flew 5 more rescue missions over the next 2 days, each one presenting unique challenges and dangers. We rescued a group of commercial fishermen who had been trapped on their boat when it ran aground on a newly formed ice shelf. We evacuated a family from a coastal ranch that had been cut off when the access road became impassable. We pulled a group of surfers from a beach where they had been camping when the disaster struck, completely unprepared for the Arctic conditions that followed. Each rescue mission reinforced how fortunate we had been to escape when we did. Many of the people we rescued had been trapped for days without adequate food, water, or shelter. Some had suffered severe frostbite or hypothermia that required immediate medical treatment. Others had watched friends or family members die from exposure or accidents related to the extreme conditions. Every story was a reminder of how thin the line was between survival and death in this new world. On our 6th mission, we encountered something that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. We were flying over an area that had been open water just a week earlier when Lieutenant Vasquez pointed out something unusual in the ice below us. There were shapes embedded in the frozen surface, dark objects that looked artificial. When we got closer, we realized we were looking at cars, trucks, and even buildings that had been caught in flash floods and then frozen solid when the temperature dropped. The realization that entire communities had been destroyed so quickly was sobering. These weren't just random vehicles that had been abandoned. These were the remnants of a small coastal town that had been wiped out in a matter of hours when the disaster began. The speed at which everything had changed was beyond anything anyone had predicted or prepared for. We were dealing with forces that could reshape entire landscapes in the span of a few days. Rodriguez and I also began to understand the long-term implications of what we were witnessing. The ice formations we were flying over weren't going to melt quickly, even if temperatures eventually returned to normal. The ash in the atmosphere was blocking enough sunlight to keep things frozen for months or possibly years. The coastal communities that had been destroyed or abandoned weren't going to be rebuilt in the same locations. Entire ways of life had been wiped out permanently. The naval officers on the Revolution shared intelligence reports about the global situation that painted an even grimmer picture. The ash cloud from Yellowstone had triggered similar cooling effects around the world, disrupting agriculture in regions that fed hundreds of millions of people. Governments were struggling to maintain basic services as transportation systems failed and supply chains collapsed. The refugee crisis we were dealing with along the Mexican coast was just one small part of a global catastrophe. Captain Morales told us something that put our rescue operations in perspective. The Mexican government was estimating that over 2 million people had been displaced from the affected areas along the United States border. Most of these refugees had nowhere to go and no resources to sustain themselves. The temporary camps and processing centers were already overcrowded, and winter was still months away. The current crisis was just the beginning of a humanitarian disaster that would last for years. On our 7th day aboard the Revolution, we received word that the rescue operations were being scaled back due to worsening weather conditions and dwindling resources. The helicopter fuel supplies were running low, and replacement parts for aircraft were becoming impossible to obtain. More importantly, the number of survivor groups that could be reached safely was decreasing as ice formations made landing zones too dangerous for helicopter operations. Rodriguez and I were faced with another difficult decision. We could stay with the naval vessel and continue rescue operations for as long as they remained viable, or we could return to the refugee processing centers and begin the process of rebuilding our lives in a world that had been fundamentally changed. The choice was complicated by the fact that our families were in different locations, and communication with them remained sporadic and unreliable. I chose to make one final rescue mission before leaving the Revolution. We had received reports of a group of survivors at a location that was very close to where Santos had died. Lieutenant Vasquez was hesitant to attempt the mission because the landing zone was marginal and the weather was deteriorating, but I convinced him that we had to try. The coordinates put the survivors near the road where Santos had been found, and I had a feeling there might be a connection. The final mission was the most dangerous we had attempted. The landing zone was a small clearing surrounded by unstable ice formations, and the helicopter had to approach at an unusual angle to avoid power lines that had been brought down by the weight of accumulated ash. When we landed, we found a group of 8 people who had been sheltering in an abandoned gas station for 6 days. Among them was an elderly woman who told us she had seen Santos walking past their shelter on the day he died. According to the woman, Santos had stopped at their shelter and shared some of his food and water with their group before continuing on his journey. He had told them about his daughter Maria and his determination to reach her somehow. The woman said that Santos had seemed to know he probably wouldn't make it, but that he felt compelled to try anyway. His final act had been one of generosity, sharing his limited supplies with strangers who needed help. Learning about Santos's final hours provided some closure for the guilt I had been carrying about his death. He had died trying to help other people, staying true to the code of honor that had guided his life as a fisherman. The elderly woman gave me Santos's fishing knife, which he had left with their group as a tool they could use for survival. She thought I should have it, as someone who had known him and could remember what kind of man he had been. The flight back to the Revolution was somber, but also marked by a sense of completion. Rodriguez and I had participated in rescuing over 60 people during our week with the naval vessel. We had used our knowledge of the ocean and weather to help save lives, and we had honored the memory of the friends we had lost. Miguel, Santos, and Pablo were gone, but their deaths had not been meaningless if they helped us save other people. Captain Morales told us that the rescue operations would continue with a skeleton crew, focusing on the most accessible survivor groups and using unmanned drones to locate people in areas too dangerous for helicopter operations. The Mexican Navy was adapting to the new reality, but resources were limited and the scale of the disaster was overwhelming their capabilities. The age of large-scale rescue operations was ending, and survivors would increasingly have to rely on their own resourcefulness. Rodriguez and I were transported back to the refugee processing center by supply helicopter, along with the 8 survivors from our final mission. The center had grown significantly during our absence, with new buildings and expanded facilities to handle the increasing number of displaced people. The organization was better, but the overcrowding was worse, and it was clear that the temporary arrangements were becoming permanent settlements. Carlos and David were still at the center when we returned, but they had found work helping with the construction of more permanent housing for refugees. They seemed to be recovering well from their ordeal, though David told me privately that he still had nightmares about watching Pablo die. Both young men had decided to stay in Mexico rather than try to return to the United States, where their home communities had been destroyed or abandoned. The reunion with Carlos and David was emotional, but it was also marked by the recognition that we were all different people than we had been a week earlier. We had survived something that had killed millions of other people, and that experience had changed us in ways we were still trying to understand. The bonds forged during our time trapped on La Gaviota were stronger than anything I had experienced in my previous life as a commercial fisherman. Rodriguez and I spent our final evening together talking about what we had learned during our 48 hours of survival and our week of rescue operations. We had witnessed the collapse of one world and the beginning of another. The ocean that had provided our livelihood was now a frozen wasteland that would take years to recover. The communities we had known were gone, and the people we had saved were refugees in a foreign country with an uncertain future. But we had also discovered something important about human resilience and adaptability. People could survive conditions that seemed impossible if they worked together and made smart decisions based on experience and instinct. The maritime skills we had developed during years of commercial fishing had been directly applicable to survival in the new Ice Age world. Our knowledge of weather patterns, navigation, and resource management had made the difference between life and death. The story of our survival was just one of thousands that would emerge from the Yellowstone disaster, but it illustrated principles that would be important for anyone trying to survive in the changed world. Trust your instincts when official channels fail. Share resources and work together rather than trying to survive alone. Use specialized knowledge and skills to help not just yourself, but also other people who need assistance. Adapt quickly to changing conditions rather than clinging to plans that no longer work. As I prepared to leave the refugee center and begin a new life in a world I didn't fully understand yet, I reflected on everything that had happened since that morning, when the radio first crackled with news of Yellowstone's eruption. The decisions I had made as captain of La Gaviota had been based on 15 years of experience reading the ocean and trusting my instincts. Some of those decisions had saved lives, and others had contributed to deaths that I would carry with me forever. The first 48 hours of the Ice Age apocalypse were over, but the real challenges were just beginning. The world had fundamentally changed, and those of us who had survived the initial disaster now had to figure out how to build new lives in a reality where the old rules no longer applied. The ocean was frozen, the sky was gray, and the future was uncertain. But we were alive, and that was something to build on.